ready to travel back in time. Today we're going deep into Peshawar, Pakistan.
Ah, Peshawar, one of South Asia's oldest cities.
It's more than just old, right? It's like a blend of all these different cultures. We're talking Persian, Afghan, Turkic.
A crossroads of civilizations.
Mhm.
And you see it most clearly in the architecture.
Which is what this deep dive is all about.
Exactly. It's fascinating how those influences created such a unique architectural style.
Okay, so I was looking at our list here. We've got the Bala Hisar Fort,
Classic.
the Mahabat Khan Mosque, the Sethi House Complex, and even the Kisakwani Bazaar.
The bazaar of storytellers. We've got a lot to cover.
We do. But before we even start, I gotta ask, how do you even begin to preserve all this amazing architecture? I mean, cities change, right?
It's a challenge, no doubt. It's a balance. But first, let's go back in time. Let's picture ourselves at the Bala Hisar Fort. Imagine these massive walls, those arched gateways, turrets.
It sounds like something out of a movie.
It's impressive, for sure. But it's not just about looks. This fort tells a story.
A story about...
Power. Control. Built in the 16th century by the Mughals,
the Mughals.
powerful dynasty, ruled much of India for centuries. This fort was a statement, strategically placed, protecting trade routes, always on guard against invaders.
Wow. So every detail had a purpose.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thick walls, the towers, those big courtyards. It all points to a world of constant conflict.
Makes you realize how different things were back then.
Definitely. And speaking of differences, those descriptions mention something interesting. The brickwork and the tile mosaics.
I noticed that too. It said they were like the ones in Samarkand. That's in Uzbekistan, right?
Right. And that's a clue.
Yeah.
You see, the Mughals, they were of Turkic origin themselves. They brought their own architectural heritage.
Yeah, so that's where that connection comes in.
And as they expanded their empire, they picked up influences. They weren't afraid to blend styles.
So we see a mix of Persian, what was it, Timurid?
Timurid, that was the dynasty in Samarkand. And of course, Indian elements too.
Wow, it's like a melting pot of architectural styles.
Exactly. And the Bala Hisar Fort is a perfect example of that.
So it wasn't just imposed from the outside, it's a real blend. Okay, I'm getting a much better sense of how Peshawar became this crossroads, but can we move on to something a bit more peaceful?
Sure. How about the Mahabat Khan Mosque? It was built later, right?
Yeah, 17th century, I think.
Right around then.
Yeah.
During the reign of Shah Jahan. And this is where things get even more interesting. We see that fusion of styles, but it's even more pronounced. Those floral patterns, the tile work.
Very intricate, right.
Incredibly so. Definitely drawing from Persian traditions, think Samarkand, Bukhara. Almost like they wanted to bring a piece of Persia right into Peshawar.
And the Mughals were fine with that.
The Mughals had their own preferences, of course. They loved grandeur. Symmetry was key for them.
So how did that work with the Persian influence?
They blended them. Look at the Mahabat Khan Mosque. You have the towering minarets, classic Persian. But then you also have the massive courtyards, the domed prayer halls, all very typical of Mughal architecture.
It's like two architectural languages coming together.
Exactly. And the result is something truly unique.
Makes you wonder what went through the minds of those architects. Did they ever worry about clashing styles, or were they just having fun with it all?
I think it was a time of incredible creativity. They were innovating. The Mahabat Khan Mosque is a perfect example of that.
Okay, so we've seen how the big rulers, the emperors, shaped the city. But what about everyday people? Would their homes show those same influences?
That's a great question. And to answer it, we need to go to the Sethi House complex. Imagine walking through the old city, narrow lanes, and then you see these grand homes built in the 19th century.
By the Sethi family, right? Merchants, I think.
You got it. Wealthy family. And their homes are like museums of Central Asian craftsmanship.
Okay, now you're making me curious. What makes them so special?
The details, the wood carvings, the lattice work, the stained glass, all done with such skill.
It sounds beautiful.
It is. And then there are the courtyards, not just open spaces, but designed in the Charbagh style.
Charbagh. I've heard that term before. It's more than just a garden, isn't it?
Right. It's a Persian concept. 4 quadrants divided by water. It symbolizes paradise.
Wow, so they brought paradise into their homes.
In a way, yes. It was a statement about their wealth, their aspirations.
So even in private spaces, they were reflecting those cultural influences. Okay, I get it. But what about public spaces, like where people gathered?
Well, for that, we need to go to the Kisakwani Bazaar.
The Bazaar of Storytellers, just the name is so evocative.
It is, isn't it? Imagine this. Narrow streets, bustling with activity. Merchants selling their wares. The the smell of spices, people bargaining,
Sounds like a sensory overload.
in the best way possible. And look up, you'll see those arched doorways, carved facades, high ceilings.
Designed to keep things cool, I bet.
Exactly. It gets hot in Peshawar. And all of these features, they echo traditional Persian and Central Asian bazaar designs.
So even in the middle of all that commerce, you still see those cultural influences.
Absolutely. The Kisa Kwani Bazaar, it's a living reminder of Peshawar's history as a crossroads, a place where people and ideas came together.
I'm starting to see how these architectural details are like footprints of history, each one telling a story, but we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore about Peshawar's architectural legacy.
There is, and we'll dive deeper into that in our next segment.
We've seen how Persian, Mughal, and even local traditions all blended together in Peshawar. But is there anything that really sets Peshawar style apart? Like what makes it unique compared to other places with Central Asian influence?
Ah, that's where things get really interesting. You see, Peshawar didn't just borrow styles, it innovated. Take the Sethi houses, for example, all that intricate woodwork.
It was beautiful.
It was, and a lot of it features this distinct floral carving. It's called Kashmiri work.
Kashmiri. But we're talking about Peshawar.
I know, right? It's a bit misleading. Turns out that style actually originated in Peshawar.
Oh, wow. So it spread from there to other places.
Exactly. And the Kashmiri work is just one example. You also see unique tile work in Peshawar, especially the glazed tiles, blues, greens, very vibrant.
So they were pushing the boundaries, taking those influences and making them their own.
They were. It shows you that there was a real local school of artisans, people experimenting with design. But that makes me wonder, all these amazing structures, do people in Peshawar still use them today? Or are they mostly just for tourists?
Yeah, that's a good question.
It varies. Some places, like the Bala Hisar Fort, are mainly military, so access is limited. But others, like the Mahabad Khan Mosque, are still active places of worship.
So for some people, these are more than just historic buildings.
Right, they're part of daily life.
Yeah.
And even the Kisa Kwani Bazaar, it attracts tourists, sure, but it's still a busy marketplace for locals.
So it's a mix. It's good to know that these places aren't just frozen in time, but I imagine keeping them in good shape, preserving them, it must be tough, especially with the city growing and changing.
Oh, definitely. Peshawar faces a lot of challenges. Urbanization is one, new buildings going up everywhere. Then there's the environment, pollution, harsh weather.
It all takes a toll.
It does.
Yeah.
And of course, resources are limited. Restoration, conservation, those things are expensive.
I imagine it's hard to prioritize sometimes.
It is. And politics, economics, they all play a role too. Sometimes development wins out over preservation.
It sounds like a constant balancing act.
It really is.
Huh.
But the good news is there are people who are passionate about this. Dedicated individuals, organizations. They work hard to document, protect, and restore these architectural treasures.
That's encouraging.
They're raising awareness, advocating for better policies.
Because in the end, it's the people who live there who matter most, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just about saving the buildings themselves. It's about keeping the traditions alive, the craftsmanship. So there are groups working to revive those old techniques,
Yeah.
training new artisans.
So it's about creating a connection between past and present. Okay, I like that. But zooming out a bit, what can other cities learn from all this? Like what makes Peshawar's experience relevant to the rest of the world?
I think Peshawar shows that development and heritage conservation, they don't have to be enemies. You can have both.
It's not an either situation.
Right. A city's history, it's an asset,
Yeah.
not something to be ignored.
And when we preserve these buildings, we're preserving something bigger, our memory, our identity.
You got it. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want you to think about one thing.
Okay, what's that?
Remember this. Architecture is a language,
Mm-hmm.
and every building has a story to tell.
And it's not just those grand buildings that have stories, right?
Right. Even the everyday ones, the houses we live in, the shops, they all have a history.
Yeah. Makes you wonder, like, what happened in that old building before it became a whatever it is now?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Architecture connects us to the past, makes it real.
It's like a grounding feeling, especially when everything is changing so fast these days.
It is. Reminds us we're part of something bigger. A long line of, well, human experience.
Okay, so we talked about the challenges of preserving all this. But what about the good stuff? What happens when we actually succeed?
Well, think about it. Restoring old buildings can bring a community back to life. It can bring in money, create jobs. People feel proud.
So it's not just about pretty buildings. It has a ripple effect.
Absolutely. And education. Historic sites can be like living classrooms.
We can learn so much from them.
Exactly. And remember, we were talking about Peshawar as a good example.
Yeah, how they're balancing progress and preservation.
Right. One big lesson is you got to get the community involved. It can't just be top down.
Local people know their own history best, right?
They do. And another thing, it's never too late. Even if a city has lost some of its heritage, you can still protect what's left.
Every little bit counts.
It does. And this is important. Preservation, it's not just about the past. It's about the future, too.
What do you mean?
We're creating something for future generations so they can experience what we experience, that wonder, that connection.
So they can tell their own stories.
Exactly. So for our listeners, what do I want them to take away from all this? What's the one thing I hope they remember?
Tell us.
Architecture. It's powerful. It tells stories. It connects us. And it can inspire us to build a better future.
I love that. And maybe they'll be inspired to go explore their own towns and cities.
Find those hidden stories.
Because every place has a story.
Absolutely.
Well, I think we've done it. We've explored Peshawar from the Bala Hisar Fort to the Kisa Kwani Bazaar.
It's been a journey.
More than just buildings, we learned about culture, identity, what makes a place special. A big thanks to our listeners for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you enjoyed exploring Peshawar with us. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and who knows, maybe you'll discover some amazing stories right where you are.